Stalingrad, February 2, 1943. The city is a frozen hell. Soviet and German forces tear at each other's throats in the rubble of what was once the industrial heart of Russia. The temperature sits at -30 degrees Celsius. Men freeze to death in their foxholes. The Volga River runs red with blood beneath sheets of ice. The Battle of Stalingrad is entering its final, most brutal phase. Among the Soviet officers coordinating the encirclement of the German Sixth Army is Colonel Dmitry Alexandrovich Kozlov, a name that appears in military dispatches, but never in public announcements. He wasn't a frontline commander leading charges across frozen streets. He didn't give speeches or pose for propaganda photographs. His war was fought in bunkers, in encrypted communications, in operations that had no official designation. Kozlov was NKVD, but not the kind who conducted purges or ran prison camps. He was something more specialized, a signals intelligence officer, an expert in German communications protocols, a man who understood that wars were won not just with bullets, but with information. Documents later discovered in Soviet archives hint at his involvement in Operation Koltso, Ring, the final assault that crushed the German pocket at Stalingrad. In the final days of the battle, as Field Marshal Paulus prepared to surrender, Kozlov was reportedly seen in meetings with General Rokossovsky's staff and senior NKVD officials. His role was never clearly defined. Even within Stalin's paranoid command structure, Kozlov operated in shadows. He processed intelligence that came from sources no one discussed. He coordinated operations that left no paper trail. And then on February 5, 1943, 3 days after the official German surrender at Stalingrad, Dmitry Kozlov vanished. No death notification, no transfer orders, no record of promotion or demotion, just a requisition form for military transport heading northeast into the Ural Mountains, and then silence. A silence that would stretch for exactly 79 years. For decades, Kozlov's name would surface only in fragments within classified Soviet documents, an invisible thread in a tapestry of wartime secrets, intelligence operations, and mysteries that officially never existed. But even the most persistent researchers couldn't answer one fundamental question. Did Colonel Dmitry Kozlov die in the war, or did he disappear into something else entirely? February 4, 1943. As Soviet forces celebrate the greatest victory in Russian military history, a convoy of 3 military trucks slips quietly out of Stalingrad under sealed orders. The vehicles are unmarked. The men inside wear standard Red Army winter uniforms, but their papers carry authorization codes that don't match any known unit designation. One of them is Colonel Dmitry Kozlov. According to a fragmentary intelligence report discovered in 1994 within formerly classified NKVD archives, Kozlov had been issued emergency relocation orders, destination classified, purpose classified under Protocol Iskra, Spark Protocol. The convoy's route was circuitous and deliberate, northeast through Soviet-controlled territory, then deep into the southern Ural Mountains. But somewhere in the remote wilderness between Chelyabinsk and Yekaterinburg, in a region of dense forest and ancient limestone caves, the convoy's trail goes completely cold. No arrival confirmation at any military installation. No radio contact logged at regional command posts. No accident reports. 3 trucks carrying approximately 12 men simply vanish into the Ural wilderness like smoke dissolving into fog. Weeks later, a local hunter stumbles upon an abandoned military vehicle near the village of Kishtim. The engine is cold. Snow covers the seats. Inside, he finds military rations, code books with entire pages burned away, a blood-stained topographical map marked with hand-drawn symbols that match no known Soviet military notation, and spent shell casings from a Tokarev pistol. No bodies, no identification papers, no explanation. The hunter reports his discovery to the local Soviet authorities. A military investigation team arrives within 48 hours, thanks him for his patriotic duty, confiscates the vehicle, and closes the case. The truck disappears. The report is classified. The hunter is warned, politely but firmly, never to speak of what he found. For decades, nothing else surfaces. Kozlov's name appears occasionally in post-war intelligence summaries, always heavily redacted. His family is told he died heroically during the defense of Stalingrad. No grave is provided. No pension is ever claimed. His military file, when researchers finally gained limited access to it in 2001, contains exactly 7 pages. Most of it is blacked out with thick ink, and yet, whispers persist. In small villages scattered throughout the southern Urals, locals speak quietly of strange occurrences in the years immediately following the war. Unusual lights seen deep in the forest at night. Soviet military personnel spotted in areas with no official bases or installations. A geologist remembers his father returning from a survey expedition in 1946, pale and shaken, speaking of hearing voices in Russian echoing from inside an unexplored cave system. Nothing provable, nothing concrete, just enough to keep the legend alive, because Dmitry Kozlov wasn't just another Soviet officer who disappeared in the chaos of war. He was a man who vanished with purpose, and what no one could explain, not for 79 years, was why. The Ural Mountains, 1943 to 1955. For those who lived in the shadow of the Ural Range, the war never truly ended. The Germans were defeated. Victory was declared. Stalin's grip tightened across the Soviet Empire. But something lingered in those ancient mountains, something that made hunters cut their expeditions short, and miners refused to explore certain cave systems. They said the Urals remembered secrets the Kremlin wanted buried. It always started the same way. Strange lights deep in the forest, not like campfires, not like electrical equipment, something in between. Then came the sounds. Mechanical hums that seemed to emanate from beneath the ground, rhythmic like generators running in hidden chambers. And occasionally, on very still nights, the crackle of radio static carrying fragments of Russian voice transmissions that were too clear, too structured to be atmospheric interference. In villages like Kishtim, Kasli, and Ozyorsk, people began to speak in hushed tones about the sealed place. A location some claimed existed deep in the mountains, where Soviet soldiers had built something during the war. A facility, a bunker, a place that was never meant to be found. Children whispered about the underground colonel, a faceless officer who lived in a fortress carved into living rock, monitoring frequencies no one else could hear. Adults dismissed it as folklore, a blend of war trauma and rural superstition. But even they noticed things. Trucks with military markings traveling remote forest roads at night, years after the war ended. Helicopters circling areas with no apparent strategic value. And most disturbing, people who asked too many questions about certain regions sometimes disappeared, reassigned to distant posts or simply never heard from again. One persistent tale involved a mining engineer named Viktor Petrov, who, in the spring of 1948, was conducting a geological survey in the southern Urals. He claimed to have discovered a reinforced steel door built into the side of a limestone cliff, camouflaged with rock facing and vegetation. He said he heard ventilation equipment running inside, the hum of electrical systems, proof that someone was maintaining the facility. When he reported his findings to his supervisors, he was immediately reassigned to a copper mine in Kazakhstan. His survey notes disappeared. His colleagues were warned not to discuss the matter. He returned to the area in 1952 with a trusted friend, intending to document the site with photographs. They found the cliff face, but the door was gone. The rock appeared natural, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. Petrov never spoke of it again publicly, but before he died in 1979, he told his son something that would haunt the family for decades. The door was still there. They just didn't want us to see it. Whether truth or paranoia, one name always seemed to surface in these stories, whispered in the same breath as the sealed place. Kozlov, Colonel Dmitry Alexandrovich Kozlov, the intelligence officer who vanished, the man the mountains never released. The 1960s to 2020, the Cold War and beyond. By the 1960s, the story of Colonel Kozlov had transformed from classified mystery to underground legend. It wasn't just a missing person case. It was folklore among a certain type of Soviet citizen, the kind who collected forbidden stories, who remembered things the state wanted forgotten, who understood that official history was written in omissions as much as facts. But for a select few, mostly retired intelligence officers and obsessive researchers, the case never went cold. It calcified into something harder than curiosity: obsession. During the Khrushchev thaw, when archives briefly opened and some wartime records were declassified, researchers tried to trace Kozlov's movements after Stalingrad. They found fragments, references to Protocol Iskra in documents that provided no explanation of what the protocol was, mentions of a special signals facility designated only by a number, Object 47, Object 47, with no location specified. Some believed Kozlov had been executed during Stalin's post-war purges, his disappearance merely bureaucratic cover for political elimination. Others thought he had been deep cover, perhaps sent to establish listening posts in remote areas to monitor American and British communications as the Cold War began. But Kozlov's name never appeared in any purge list. No execution record. No mention in any of the defector testimonies that came out during the Cold War. That was unusual. Officers of his rank, with his access to sensitive intelligence, didn't simply vanish without someone, somewhere, keeping a record. In 1976, a journalist named Alexei Gromov began investigating disappearances of Soviet intelligence officers during and after World War II. He traveled to the Urals, interviewed elderly villagers, explored abandoned military installations. His research notes, later acquired by his daughter after his death, mentioned Kozlov specifically. He had interviewed a former NKVD quartermaster who claimed Kozlov had been assigned to a special communications project, location unknown, priority classification absolute. Gromov's article was never published. He died in a car accident in 1978. His research materials disappeared. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, archives opened more widely. Historians and journalists descended on formerly classified documents like scavengers. Kozlov's name appeared in a few files, always in fragments, always raising more questions than answers. In 2005, a Russian military history foundation launched a digital project to track missing Soviet officers from World War II. Kozlov's file was labeled Status Neopredelioni, Status Undetermined. No grave, no death certificate, no confirmed last location. Just a service record that ended abruptly in February 1943 with the words Perevedon na specialnoye zadanie, transferred to special assignment. Over time, even the most dedicated researchers gave up. The Cold War ended. Russia changed. New mysteries replaced old ones. The Urals kept their secrets. But some stories refuse to die. They hibernate in old documents and aging memories, waiting. And when a team of geologists stumbled upon something impossible in the summer of 2022, they wouldn't just find an old bunker. They would tear open a chapter of history that was never supposed to be read. August 3rd, 2022. It was supposed to be a routine geological survey for rare earth mineral deposits, nothing more than a commercial exploration project. A team of Russian geologists was conducting ground-penetrating radar scans in a remote section of the southern Urals, approximately 70 kilometers northeast of Chelyabinsk. The terrain was brutal, dense forest, steep limestone formations, and caves that descended into unexplored depths. Dr. Yevgeny Volkov, a 52-year-old geophysicist from the Ural Federal University, was analyzing the radar data when he noticed something that shouldn't exist. A large void approximately 15 meters below the surface, too regular to be a natural cave formation, with what appeared to be reinforced structures and right angles that nature doesn't create. At first, he thought it might be an old mine shaft or perhaps a forgotten Soviet-era mineral extraction site. But when they cross-referenced the location with historical maps and geological surveys, there was no record of any mining activity in that specific area, ever. He marked the coordinates and reported it to the project supervisor. Within 36 hours, the site was visited by officials from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Within 72 hours, a military engineering team had established a secure perimeter around the location. The press was told nothing. Local authorities were instructed to redirect any curious civilians. The official statement, when one was finally issued, described it only as investigation of a potential Cold War-era installation requiring assessment for environmental and safety purposes. But the truth was far more extraordinary. What Dr. Volkov had found wasn't just an old bunker. It was a sealed installation that had been deliberately hidden and forgotten. Hidden beneath 79 years of forest growth, geological shifting, and institutional amnesia, was a facility that had no business still existing. What the mountains had concealed for nearly 8 decades was not just a structure, it was a secret. And inside, something had been waiting in the dark since 1943. The excavation. September 2022. The excavation began under the strictest possible security protocols. No media access, no public statements. Just a specialized team of military engineers, structural specialists, and a small contingent of historians from the Russian Federal Archives operating under direct orders from Moscow. The site was extraordinarily difficult to access. The entrance, when they finally located it, had been buried under rockfall and decades of sediment. It took 4 weeks to clear a safe access point without triggering a collapse of the entire underground structure. When they finally breached the entrance, they found a reinforced steel door, Soviet military grade, rusted but intact, and most significantly, it was locked from the inside. The mechanism was a complex manual locking system that required both a key and a combination. The engineering team had to cut through carefully, using plasma torches while monitoring for explosive booby traps, a common security measure in sensitive Soviet installations. When the door finally opened, stale air rushed out, air that hadn't circulated with the outside world in 79 years. The temperature inside was constant, maintained by the insulating properties of the surrounding rock, and what they found preserved inside was remarkable. A facility carved directly into the limestone, reinforced with concrete and steel, not large, approximately the size of a modest apartment, but meticulously constructed. The main chamber contained sophisticated radio equipment, far more advanced than standard field units of the 1940s, transmission equipment, receivers, code machines, battery systems, all dormant but largely intact. Along one wall, storage units held preserved food in sealed containers, medical supplies, water filtration equipment, fuel for generators. This wasn't a temporary shelter. It was designed for long-term habitation. And in the smaller adjacent chamber, they found what they'd been hoping for and dreading: evidence of occupation, a cot with military blankets, a small table with maps spread across it, weighted down with rocks, a kerosene lamp, personal items. And sitting at the table, slumped forward with his head resting on his arms, was a body. Mummified by the stable temperature and low humidity, the figure was remarkably preserved. The uniform was Soviet military, winter issue, an officer's greatcoat. When they carefully examined the body, they found a leather document case on the table beside the remains. Inside was a military identification booklet, the red cover faded but legible. The photograph showed a stern-faced man with dark eyes and a military bearing. The name on the document, Polkovnik Dmitry Alexandrovich Kozlov. After 79 years, the vanished colonel had been found. But the mystery was only beginning. Because what else they found in that sealed bunker suggested Kozlov hadn't died in 1943. He had survived, for years, alone in the dark, waiting for something that never came: the body, forensic analysis. The remains were carefully transported to a secure medical facility in Yekaterinburg, under military guard. Despite nearly 80 years in the bunker, the preservation was extraordinary. The sealed environment, constant temperature, and low humidity had created conditions similar to a controlled storage facility. Soft tissue had desiccated, but bone structure, dental remains, and even some hair follicles remained intact. The body was in a seated position, suggesting death had come peacefully, or at least without violence. There were no signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no evidence of struggle. Dental records were compared against Kozlov's military medical file from the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. The match was conclusive. Additional confirmation came from a fortunate genealogical connection. In 2018, Kozlov's great-niece, Natalia Kozlova, a doctor living in Moscow, had submitted her DNA to a genealogy database while researching her family history. Her grandfather had been Dmitry Kozlov's younger brother. When mitochondrial DNA was extracted from bone samples and compared against Natalia's genetic profile, the results were irrefutable. 99.4% certainty. The man in the bunker was Colonel Dmitry Alexandrovich Kozlov. The forensic examination revealed critical details about his final years. Bone density analysis suggested prolonged vitamin D deficiency, consistent with years spent underground with minimal sunlight exposure. Dental wear patterns indicated a diet of preserved foods. Skeletal markers showed evidence of chronic stress and malnutrition in his final months. Time of death was estimated between late 1947 and early 1948, based on decomposition patterns, the condition of his clothing, and carbon dating of organic materials found near the body. He had survived the war, survived 4 to 5 years alone in that sealed chamber, long enough for Stalin to consolidate power, long enough for the Cold War to begin, long enough for the world to forget he ever existed. But why? Why seal himself in? Why never emerge? Why let years pass in isolation when the war was over and he could have returned to Moscow, to his family, to his life? The answer wasn't in the bones. It was in what surrounded them, in the documents scattered across the table, in the journal found beneath his hand, in the radio logs that filled an entire shelf, evidence not of a man hiding, but of a man on a mission that never ended. The artifacts, evidence of Protocol Iskra. Throughout the bunker, investigators found what they'd been seeking and what they'd feared most: evidence of purpose, evidence of a mission that extended far beyond any normal military assignment. The radio equipment was the first clue. This wasn't standard field communication gear. It was a sophisticated long-range transmission and monitoring station, capable of intercepting and decoding encrypted communications across multiple frequencies. The equipment bore manufacturer stamps from 1942 and 1943, but it had been modified extensively, upgraded with components that suggested someone with advanced technical knowledge had been maintaining and improving it. Next to the radio station was a logbook, thick, bound in military-issue canvas, hundreds of pages filled with meticulous handwriting in Russian, transmission logs, frequency notations, timestamps, coded messages received and sent. The first entry was dated February 10th, 1943. The last entry was November 17, 1947. Kozlov had been operational in this bunker for nearly 5 years, but the most significant discovery was a sealed metal case, similar to those used for classified documents, stored in a locked cabinet. When the military archivists opened it, they found operational orders, communications from NKVD headquarters, and a directive signed by Lavrenti Beria himself, head of the NKVD and one of Stalin's most trusted executioners. The directive outlined Protocol Iskra. The language was deliberately vague, couched in euphemisms and code words, but the intent was clear. A network of deep-cover listening posts was to be established in remote locations throughout the Soviet Union. These stations would monitor both external threats, Allied communications, and internal threats, potential dissent within the Soviet military and political structure. The officers selected for this assignment were to operate in complete isolation. No contact with families, no communication with regular military channels. They would receive orders through encrypted transmissions and would remain in position indefinitely or until recalled by specific coded signal. Kozlov had been assigned to Station Ural 7, one of at least 12 such installations referenced in the documents. His mission was to monitor German communications during the war and after the German surrender, to shift focus to Western Allied transmissions as tensions rose between the Soviet Union and its former allies. Among the documents was also a personal journal, separate from the operational logs. The first entry was dated February 8, 1943. The final entry was October 30, 1947. The early entries were clinical, professional, focused on establishing the station, testing equipment, maintaining operational security. But as months turned into years, the tone changed. The entries became more personal, more reflective, more desperate. One entry from June 1945, just after the German surrender, read, "The war is over. I heard it on intercepted Allied transmissions before Moscow confirmed, but my orders remain unchanged. I am to maintain position and continue monitoring. How long? No one has said." Another from March 1946. 17 months since I saw another human face. The isolation is becoming difficult. I speak to myself to remember the sound of my own voice. I dream of my wife, my daughter. Are they still in Moscow? Do they think I am dead? And then, from August 1947, no supply drop in 14 months. Rations are nearly exhausted. The last encrypted transmission I received was in April. Since then, nothing. Have they forgotten me? Has Protocol Iskra been terminated and no one thought to recall the stations? Or am I being tested? The final entry was the most haunting. Brief, written in a shaky hand. October 30th, 1947. No transmissions received in 6 months. Equipment failing, food exhausted. I have done my duty. I have remained at my post. I do not know if anyone is listening anymore, but I continue to send the daily status report. If I do not survive, let the record show that I obeyed my orders until the end. For the motherland. Always. The journal ended there. Based on the forensic evidence, Kozlov likely died within weeks of that final entry, his body slowly desiccating in the sealed chamber, surrounded by the equipment he'd maintained faithfully for 5 years, waiting for a recall signal that never came. Protocol Iskra, the hidden network. Until the bunker's discovery, Protocol Iskra existed only as a rumor, the kind of classified operation that intelligence historians suspected existed but could never prove. Now, with Kozlov's documents in hand, researchers had unprecedented evidence. The protocol was real, and it was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The documents found in Station Ural 7 referenced at least 12 other installations, scattered across the Soviet Union in remote, difficult-to-access locations. The Caucasus Mountains, the Kamchatka Peninsula, the forests of Siberia, the Central Asian steppes. Each station was designated by a number and operated under the same protocols: complete isolation, encrypted communication only, indefinite deployment. Declassified Western intelligence files from the late 1940s, re-examined in light of this discovery, suddenly made sense. CIA reports from 1948 noted unusual patterns of radio transmissions emanating from remote Soviet territories, signals that didn't match known military frequencies or patterns. The analysts had theorized it might be a clandestine communication network, but without concrete evidence, the theory was never pursued. The term Iskra translates to spark, a word with deep significance in Russian revolutionary history. Lenin had named his underground newspaper Iskra, symbolizing the spark that would ignite revolution. In the context of this protocol, it suggested something dormant, something designed to remain hidden until activated, a network of watchers waiting for the signal to emerge. These weren't agents gathering intelligence abroad. They were men buried within Soviet territory, monitoring everything: foreign communications, domestic military channels, perhaps even Communist Party internal communications. In Stalin's paranoid worldview, threats came from everywhere, including within. Russian military historians, granted limited access to the findings, discovered references to Protocol Iskra in previously overlooked documents from 1943. A memo from Beria to Stalin mentioned the need for autonomous monitoring capabilities that operate outside normal command structures, language that now seemed clearly related to the protocol. Most chilling was a budget document from 1944 that allocated resources for long-term strategic intelligence infrastructure, including supplies and equipment for isolated stations with expected deployment duration of 5 to 10 years or longer. The implication was staggering. The Soviet Union had created a network of officers who were expected to disappear into remote locations and remain there for years, possibly decades, monitoring and waiting. And when the war ended and the Cold War began, someone in Moscow had apparently decided the network was either no longer needed or too dangerous to maintain. The stations were simply abandoned, the officers left to die at their posts, because bringing them back would mean acknowledging the network existed. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, the best way to keep a secret was to bury everyone who knew about it. If Kozlov's station was one of 12, how many others are still out there? How many other officers died alone in sealed bunkers, waiting for recall orders that were never sent? And most disturbing, could any of them have survived longer than Kozlov, maintaining their posts into the 1950s, 1960s, or beyond? Life in isolation. The waiting years. The journal and operational logs painted a devastating picture of Kozlov's life in Station Ural 7. He had arrived in February 1943 with approximately 6 months of supplies. The installation had been prepared in advance by NKVD engineers, carved into the mountain, equipped and stocked. His routine was military precise. Wake at 0600 hours, equipment check and maintenance, monitoring sessions at designated frequencies, physical exercise in the limited space, meal preparation, more monitoring, equipment maintenance, sleep at 2200 hours, every day, for 5 years. Supply drops were scheduled quarterly, delivered by helicopter to a designated location approximately 1 kilometer from the bunker entrance. Kozlov would trek through the forest at night, retrieve the containers, and return before dawn. The supplies included food, fuel, replacement parts for the radio equipment, encrypted orders, and occasionally, letters from NKVD headquarters. Never from family. The isolation was absolute. The journal entries from the first year were professional, focused, optimistic even. He wrote about the importance of the mission, about serving the motherland, about the critical intelligence he was gathering as the war raged. But as the war ended and supply drops became irregular, the tone shifted. He wrote about the silence, about the weight of isolation, about questioning whether his transmissions were being received. In one entry from July 1946, he wrote, "I have been here 3.5 years. In that time, I have sent over 1,200 intelligence reports. I have never received acknowledgement of a single one. I transmit into silence and hope someone is listening." The log showed he maintained his monitoring schedule rigorously until mid-1947, even as supplies dwindled and equipment began failing. He rationed his food meticulously, calculating that he could extend his supplies by reducing intake to minimal survival levels. In September 1947, he noted that he had not received a supply drop in 13 months. The last encrypted transmission he'd received was in April. He wrote, "I do not know if I have been forgotten or if this is a test of loyalty. Either way, my orders were to remain at my post. I will obey." The final weeks were the hardest to read. His handwriting deteriorated. Entries became shorter. He wrote about weakness, about difficulty maintaining the equipment, about the cold as his fuel reserves depleted. But even in his last coherent entry, he maintained his discipline. He recorded his daily status report. Station Ural 7 operational. Officer Kozlov at post, awaiting orders. He died as he had lived for 5 years, alone, faithful, waiting. The bunker was found exactly as he'd left it. Maps still on the table. Equipment in maintenance position. His greatcoat hanging on a hook by the door. Everything organized, everything maintained, even as he slowly starved and froze. A monument to duty that had transcended reason. The maps, evidence of the network. Among the documents in Kozlov's bunker, investigators found something that changed the entire scope of the investigation. A hand-drawn map of the Soviet Union, marked with locations and coded designations. The map was crude but precise, drawn on thick paper with careful attention to geographical features. Scattered across it were 12 symbols, small triangles marked with numbers. Each triangle had a coded designation: Ural 7, Kavkaz 3, Sibir 9, Primor 4, and others. These were the other stations, the other elements of Protocol Iskra. When the locations were cross-referenced with modern maps and compared to known Soviet military installations, the pattern became clear. Each site was in an extremely remote location, far from populated areas, far from normal military bases, positioned in terrain that made access difficult and detection unlikely. Some were in mountain ranges, others in dense forests. One appeared to be in the Arctic tundra, another in the deserts of Central Asia. Locations chosen not for strategic military value, but for isolation and concealment. Beside each triangle on the map was a name, presumably the officer assigned to that station. Most of the names meant nothing to researchers, but 3 were recognizable from military records: Soviet officers who had disappeared during or shortly after the war, officially listed as killed in action or missing. They hadn't died in combat. They'd been assigned to Protocol Iskra, and like Kozlov, they had vanished into the Soviet wilderness, buried alive in secret installations, waiting for orders that may never have come. Also found among the papers was a list titled Station Status Reports, dated April 1945. It listed all 12 stations with brief operational notes. Most were marked functioning or operational. 2 were marked no contact. 1 was marked compromised, possible security breach. What happened to those stations? To those officers? Did they die like Kozlov, faithful to the end? Or did some abandon their posts, walk out of their bunkers and try to return to civilization, only to be arrested and